This is a true crime podcast. It contains adult themes and content and may not be suitable for all listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
You lost all constitutional rights the moment you walked through that door. When the judge sat down there, I sentenced you to 10 years at the Idaho State Penitentiary. You walked in that door, you was a number. And the inmates understood that.
If you're out there and live past the period to be in here, just lay down and do it.
Those inmates that were here in the institution during an execution, it had an impression on them that maybe was still with them to some extent. Maybe they don't think about it anymore, but it had an impression on them, I'm sure.
They wouldn't let me out until I get back to stuff. 7 months later, I give it back to them.
That was one of the problems we ran into. Is you had 5 or 6 guys that were sitting in a place, smoking and joking and drinking coffee. Pretty quick, they'd hatched a plan in there to get under your skin some way or try to figure a way out.
Welcome back, folks, to another episode of the Behind Gray Walls podcast, a podcast about the old Idaho State Penitentiary and the men and women who lived and worked here. My name's Anthony. I'm in the studio here with Sam.
How are you doing, everybody?
And we are live via phone with Skye.
It's me, and Skye has a fun new adventure. It's called Broken Ankle.
Oh, not just like any broken ankle, but like...
Yeah, it was
surgery.
It was a freak accident. Was playing soccer. My cleat got stuck in the turf, and so when I turned, my foot didn't. I broke both bones on the inside and outside of my ankle, and then when my foot turned, I actually splintered, I think it's the tibia bone that connects to your ankle. And so I now have some really great new hardware, 9 screws and a plate and a guide wire that keeps everything in place. So, unfortunately, it doesn't do anything cool. Like, I'm bionic, but not in a cool way. But the good news is, since I get to be off my feet for a little bit, we can record at least what we have, though I have been sleeping a lot. So that may impact... what happens, how quickly the podcast comes out in the future. That's a spoiler, kind of.
Skye, one thing I really appreciate about you is your ability to go above and beyond. You can't be an expert in one Hollywood movie. You have to be an expert in all of them. You can't get your master's. You have to get your PhD. And even when it comes to breaking bones, you can't just break one of them. You got to break all of them.
Do you know what's so funny is you are literally the second person to say that, and here's the thing is I can't disagree with you. Like I've always said, like if I'm into something, I am into it, and if I'm not interested, I could not care less.
You don't
do
things halfway, Skye.
No. That's exactly what my friend said, and I was like, you're so right that even when I break my bone, I have to go all out. So I mean, I guess I'm learning that can be bad also.
Yeah,
that's true. That is true.
But how are you guys? No broken bones among you two?
Definitely less.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
No, all things considered are fantastic comparatively. Yeah. Wow.
Yes.
Great.
Sorry to say.
And you know what? I'm just happy that everyone else gets to live their lives like normal.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm so glad that everything is going everything. Yeah, I actually think that you guys should shut everything down while I'm off my feet. That's only fair.
Okay.
No, that would be.
Anthony's like, please.
That sounds great. Actually,
I'll do anything.
We, on the other hand, are running up and down stairs. We are getting things ready for our Halloween events over October.
Yay!
So any of you listeners out there, if you haven't already, go pick up your tickets right now. We're going to sell out. We've already sold out our Sleepless in Stripes event, which is the first weekend of October. The second weekend, it's behind-the-scenes tours. You get to go down into the dungeon. You get to go up to the upper floors of some of the cell houses that you usually can't access. It's really fun, and we're going to open up a new building this year, so it's going to be really cool. And at the end of the month, we have Squawky and Spirits, which is our big Halloween party, and we have all kinds of things going on from Thriller Dance to 2 haunted houses, which is what Samuel and a lot of our staff are spending a lot of time hopping things up and down the stairs to build. And Sam is putting on a live presentation with some live music.
It's going to be really, really fun. Yeah, we have a live Charlie Burry, who's been on the podcast a couple of times, is going to saw away at the fiddle, and we're going to see who's better, Charlie or the devil. Spoiler, it's going to be Charlie. We got some great performances, and we've already sold out of Sleepless. We've sold out of the Paranormal Investigation. Those tickets for behind the scenes in Squawky Spirits, they are hot. They're going fast. Go purchase them right now if you want a chance of getting into these events. They are going to be incredible.
Yep, links in the description.
Talk about going all out. I mean, Halloween is everyone's favorite time at the penitentiary.
It's true. It's true. It's going to be fun. It's going to be a lot of fun.
So jealous. I will maybe be back on my feet by then. I'm not sure. Ooh. But I'm excited to just get back to a normal sort of set of stories. I feel like we've kind of had a little bit of an unusual sort of beginning of the season, and we'll have an unusual middle. So I'm excited to get back to just a couple of fairly normal stories. I mean, I don't want to speak for Anthony because you guys always have the craziest, but I'm excited. So how about you start us off today?
All right, I'd be happy to. So today I am covering Frank William Grooms, number 11401, 12493, and 12679.
All right.
Sources, of course, his prison files and oral histories located at the Idaho State Archives, digitized Idaho statesman articles from Newsbank hosted by the Boise Public Library, newspapers.com, ancestry.com, and a November 2008 information request from the Nevada legislator to the Nevada Department of Corrections. I've been wanting to cover Frank Grooms for a few seasons now, and it's a crazy coincidence that actually happened here at the Old Pen with a member of the staff from our janitorial team. So we'll get to that a little bit later. But I learned Frank's story about 7 years ago while creating the exhibit that's currently in Treehouse at the site. The only full cell assignment list I've seen is from November 1973, a month before all the residents were transferred out of this prison to the new one. And I pulled the files of all these men and got all of their mug shots. We actually have them on display, so you get to see the last men to spend time in each of those cells. And I tried to find interesting things that they were doing, what their jobs were primarily in prison. These guys are from 73, that's 51 years ago. I didn't want to offend family or victims or anything like that. So it was just, mostly it's about mopping and other things like that. But when you see Frank's cell, this is why I'm telling the story. It is a wild ride. We even have these oral history clips, as I mentioned, that talk about Frank. So he's been kind of on my radar for years, and it's a hard story. And I will say it doesn't end well. And I apologize right off the bat. So, Frank Grooms was born July 21st, 1941 in Bakersfield, California, to Otis and Dorothy Grooms. Frank was the youngest of 4 children. He had 2 sisters and an older brother who was the eldest of the siblings. His father was a common laborer, and the family moved regularly to follow work. I found one article in the Record Searchlight from Redding, California from December 1956 that listed Frank among a group of 6 high school students who began an agriculture co-op, swine enterprise. So the local chapter of the Future Farmers of America purchased pigs for the students, who oversaw taking care of the pigs and selling them. Besides pigs, they also raised sheep, cows, and grew experimental crops. So this love of working with farm animals it's a huge feature of Frank's life. However, not long after this article, Frank appears to have strayed from his pig-raising responsibilities. Due to the lack of regular stability in his home life and likely mixing with the wrong crowd, he dropped out of school around 9th grade. Looking at his record and hearing firsthand from our guest that will appear later in the show, Frank liked to chase girls. On October 1st, 1958, 17-year-old Frank entered his first marriage. According to his intake file, it was a court-ordered wedding to 16-year-old Shirley. Shirley was pregnant, And according to the Siskiyou Daily News, I found that their son was born a little over 4 months later in February 1959. So 17 and 16-year-old have their first child together. Before his son was born, Frank had his first serious run-in with the law. On January 19th, 1959, a month before his son's birth, Frank and his friend James Saints stole a Mercury sedan from Eureka, California, and rolled into Canby, California, in the northeast corner of the state. They tried to, quote, bum a full tank of gasoline, end quote. So basically, driving up to this gas station in a stolen car, and we're like, hey, we don't have any money. Could we please just have a tank of gas? Officers were immediately notified, and Frank and James were stopped near the YMCA in town and arrested. And it appears they were likely just booked in the county jail and maybe fined. You know, they're 17-year-old kids. This didn't stop his criminal career. 3.5 months later, on May 1st, 1959, Frank was charged again with car theft in Stockton, California. Quote, highway patrolmen said they apprehended the youths as they were changing license plates stolen from a car. According to officers, the boys had stolen a car in San Francisco with Oregon license plates and were attempting to replace them with California plates, end quote. Just months before his 18th birthday, Frank is caught a second time stealing cars. While awaiting their time to see the judge, Frank and his partner remained in jail. His other crimes began to catch up to him. A letter arrived from the Siskiyou County alleging that Frank had committed check fraud. He was transferred to the Siskiyou County Jail to await trial for that charge. 2 days before his 18th birthday, on July 19th, 1959, he was sentenced to the Northern Reception Center Clinic at Perkins, California, where he was received on September 3rd, 1959. This is a juvenile correctional facility. So I went into a bit of a rabbit hole about this institution and their philosophies, and there happened to be a write-up about it in April 1959. Author Bill Boyarsky stated, quote, it's a gathering place for Northern California's habitual juvenile delinquents. From there, they are either sent to another institution or placed on parole. Boys who make up 66% of the clinic's population are there because they have repeatedly committed felonies, mostly burglaries and auto thefts, end quote. So Frank obviously fits in with this population. They had vocational training, which required these troubled youths to stay a minimum of 5 to 6 months to learn a trade. Unfortunately, escapes at the institution were all too common. Quote, before the war, there used to be anywhere from 100 to 150 escapes a year, Assistant Superintendent Montgomery said. In 1953, we had cut them down to 53, and last year there were only 11 escapes. 8 of those were from the farm outside the walls, end quote. The assistant superintendent and, as noted in the article, track star in California, noted the same issue we still see today. Quote, if a boy behaves himself, chances are his life will be more pleasant than it was at home, since most of the wards came from economically depressed neighborhoods, end quote. Another article appeared a month before Frank arrived in which California's Youth Authority was going to use this Northern Reception Center Clinic in a 3-year study to understand how California's juvenile system worked. Due to his age and the place of his incarceration, I couldn't find any other details about Frank in the system, but he was likely a part of the study of the juvenile correctional program.
Remind me what year this is?
1959.
That's what I thought. Okay, interesting.
An article in the Sacramento Bee in March 1960 summarized the philosophy about treating juvenile delinquents. While talking about her work at the Northern Reception Center Clinic, Dr. Dorothy Zietz said, quote, the child caught in a delinquent act is pretty frightened. He gets tight inside. What happens to him depends on so many things, on how he is handled by the police and how he feels about the parents at home. The tension that builds up is not always constructive. The child builds up an anti-authority feeling that orients him to nonconformity. Institutionalization can harden this. It broadens his experience of criminal acts through contact with others who have committed them. That is why it is so important not to treat a child like an adult criminal. A great deal of criminality is induced in the child by what happens to him during these first few delinquencies. I think the delinquent child should be essentially regarded as a troubled child. End quote.
I love this. Yeah, that is so interesting because we get to see, the 1950s, there is this huge explosion both in sort of a study of prisons as an institution and also understanding psychology. And so I feel like this is like a perfect melding of these two subjects that are culturally really coming to a head, I feel like, at this time.
Yeah. And he's right there like a test subject. And
yeah.
I mean, that shaped the second half of the century, you know, how we deal with and look at rehabilitation and where should we treat crime? Where should this all start? And they're saying, you know, it has to happen in the home and in the neighborhood before we get to this point. And then when we get to this point, you know, we have to treat it not as, you know, future adult felon convicts, criminals, but as like troubled children. And
yeah, it's such an important shift because before that, if you ever went to prison, that's it. You're branded as a terrible person for life. This is the beginning of us finally understanding, oh, maybe this isn't just a black and white kind of situation. Maybe there are other things to take into consideration. So I love that. Interesting.
All of the oral histories which said that coming to the Idaho Penitentiary was like coming home because they knew all of them from the St. Anthony's Home for Boys.
Yeah, it breeds it, unfortunately, if it's not done well and done correctly. But anyway, I couldn't find if Frank served out his sentence or if he was paroled from the clinic. Regardless, he couldn't stop his impulse to take things from other people. In May 1961, Frank was arrested again 2 months before his 21st birthday. Quote, according to deputies, Mrs. Norma Silva, who works on the Ken Waters Ranch at Big Springs, had placed her watch on a windowsill in the milk house, and grooms, who allegedly came to the ranch for some milk, apparently picked it up. Deputies said they found the watch jammed into a crack in the chicken house at Grooms' place. The watch was identified by the jeweler's mark, end quote. So this is just a needless, petty theft while he's literally on a milk run. He spent 60 days in jail for this, and it seems he kept his nose clean, or at least got away with any other thefts for about a year. When he wasn't breaking the law or being punished for it, women seemed to fill his time. According to Frank's intake form, he had a nervous breakdown in 1962. He noted that his wife was running around town, which seems to imply that she was going around with other men. This led him to a short stint in the Northern State Hospital in Sedro-Woolley, Washington, from February to May 1962. It seems like every place he was incarcerated was doing a study or trying something new. The Northern State Hospital in 1962 was experimenting with the buddy system, in which institutional residents volunteered to aid and assist less abled residents. So, you know, like you, Skye. Like
who wants to be my buddy?
Who wants to be your buddy, yeah. But doctors at the institution noted that the volunteered helpers, quote, enjoyed improvement of mood, general alertness, ego function, and general outlook for ultimate social recovery and rehabilitation. Those patients who were helped benefited from the emotional comfort and friendly attention they received and repaid those efforts with affection and gratefulness, end quote.
That's actually just a description of me after writing my dissertation and emerging from my apartment and learning I needed friends. That's just, everything improved. Life felt like worth living again.
Oh.
I mean, you know, a little dramatic, but
yeah,
but really, I mean, back to it, that's very sweet. And again, going back to the idea that we're really applying psychology and being like, oh, humans need to be around other humans and they'll get better faster.
Yeah. And one thing that we hear so often, especially from people who are recently incarcerated, who are released, giving back to the community, you know, doing charity work and volunteering and stuff, that helps them stay clean. You know, that idea of volunteerism and giving back is such a powerful thing that, you know, just like gratitude, you know, it's so important in our daily lives to keep ourselves in check and keep ourselves grounded and connected to everybody else. It's this really cool pro-social rehabilitative program. It may have also, I think, given Frank some ideas later in his criminal career, this idea of other people taking care of him or others. We'll get to that.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Frank didn't like sticking around and being somebody's buddy, he escaped from this institution on May 13th, 1962. And he heads south. In July 1962, he's arrested in Nogales, Arizona, and charged for carrying a concealed weapon. He serves just over 2 weeks in jail. Soon after, he's arrested for bogus checks. He and a man named John Murrah pled guilty, and at the age of 21, having spent the previous 3 years in and out of jails, juvenile institutions, and hospitals, Frank Grooms enters the prison for the first time on August 15th, 1962. The judge sentenced the two men to 12 to 15 months in the state prison in Phoenix, Arizona for passing worthless checks in downtown Nogales. The Arizona State Prison, located near Phoenix in Florence, Arizona, is a lot like the old Idaho Penitentiary. It opened as Arizona's first state prison and was constructed by prisoners from Arizona's territorial prison located in Yuma, Arizona. So the prisoners were brought from Yuma to construct the new site. And now, like the old Idaho Penitentiary today, once that was completed, Yuma closed and is one of 4 territorial prisons you can still visit today that are active prison museums. The state prison in Florence opened in 1908 and actually remained open for 114 years.
Wow.
It closed in 2022.
Whoa.
Yeah. The prison held some of Arizona's most notorious criminals and served as a location for over 80 executions completed by hanging, gas chamber, and lethal injection. Just before his arrival, the Arizona Republic newspaper broke down the prison's population at the time. Quote, 355 persons imprisoned for burglary and 343 for bogus checks. The next highest number was 201 for grand theft. Arizona State Prison holds 117 murderers and 157 sex offenders, end quote. Arizona's population capacity was nearly triple the old Idaho Penitentiary's maximum population. They held 1,651 men and 43 women in 1962. Within the first 2 weeks of Frank's arrival, an escape attempt occurred. 3 men in their early 20s, just like Frank, attempted to scale a 15-foot barbed wire-covered fence in the prison's athletic field at the end of their 2-hour rec time. 2 made it over the fence, but the third was shot and killed in the attempt. The 2 others were captured moments later, and this probably served as a deterrent for Frank not to attempt an escape. I didn't see any sign of him misbehaving, and he was actually paroled out of the state on April 19, 1963, serving 8 months behind bars. He told authorities that he got a job operating the Ferris wheel for West Coast Shows, a traveling circus and fair. The week he was released, they were performing at the El Portal Shopping Center in San Pablo near San Francisco. They had a free 8-act circus performance, twin Ferris wheels, the Scrambler, the Tilt-A-Whirls, and other fun fair rides that traveled up and down the West Coast between Oregon and California. I can only imagine the freedom of what this felt like after all of these years that he has already spent in institutions.
And like, that's so interesting because it's also kind of on the tail end of sort of the, I guess, ubiquity of the circus. Like,
yeah.
And the traveling, entertainment is really, I think, kind of on its last legs by the 60s.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is, again, so interesting. Yeah. And do you guys like those kind of fair rides? Do you guys go to the Western Idaho Fair every year?
I went when I was a kid. I used to go every year. Mostly I liked the food, the greasy, greasy stuff.
Yeah.
I was never...
Tiger's eyes.
Oh, yeah.
Big scones.
Yeah. I liked the one that spins around.
The UFO where you you have to just put your arms across your chest and it just pins you to the wall.
I loved that one. And I loved like the fun houses, like the spooky horror fun house. Yeah. But I've never felt comfortable on any of those coasters. They're just...
Ooh, yeah. I mean, I went on them. Loved them as a kid.
Yeah.
Now I feel like I'm way too motion sick. Like, the thought of one of them, I think, would make me throw up.
It's always such an interesting, just view of Idaho culture when you go to the fair. There's so many different groups from so many different backgrounds, and it's always very fascinating to be like, who all has come to this event.
Yeah. And I feel like in Idaho, much like everywhere else, I'm sure that that the fair animals are equally a draw. Like, I had a friend who showed llamas every year.
Yeah.
And, you know, little kids love to go feed the animals and stuff. I need to go back to the fair. I never made it to the big Texas State Fair. It was always 800 degrees, and I never wanted to go be around people when it's that hot outside.
Oh, man.
Anyway, back to our traveling circus.
Yeah.
Man. Sorry.
No, you're fine.
I've been off my feet talking to my mom for 3 weeks.
Yeah, so in August 1963, this reporter from the Eugene Guard in Eugene, Oregon, interviewed the general manager of the show. His name was Jim Lance. And the article was titled, "Carney Boss Tries for Clean Show." And it talks about how family-friendly the atmosphere was at the fair. Quote, "He's quick to defend his employees and tries to refute charges that Carney people are of low character. We have about the best people you can find in this business. If they look rough at times, it's because of the conditions under which we live and work. Look, when we got here Monday morning, we had moved some of this section 250 miles. We closed at Eureka at 11 p.m. Sunday, broke down, and traveled all night before we could set up here. Sure, they get dirty, but they are clean when we open on the new stand." End quote. The journalist asked if people's tastes in rides had changed throughout his 24 years in the business, and he said, quote, "Well, let's put it this way. Without a merry-go-round and a Ferris wheel, you just don't have a carnival. There's new rides, but these old ones stay strong." End quote.
So true.
Right, and it's so cool that Frank is running the Ferris wheel.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow, that's so funny. I can imagine him helping them break down the Ferris wheel, all these parts, putting it in these giant semis, traveling up from California, San Francisco Bay Area, up to California to Eugene, setting this up and knowing that he's going to be working all day, collecting money and everything else, and running this Ferris wheel all day long. So I just was like, what a funny thing, to tie him to. And like Skye was saying, it's like at the tail end of this kind of traveling circus, vibe, and it's transforming more to rides and food that we still see today. While he's holding his job, it seemed like he was staying out of trouble, and he could have just kind of continued this life. It seems like it matches up with his regular, being a tumbleweed. He's not used to setting roots down. Instead, around that time, his boss was defending carnival workers. Frank decides to skip the fair and go to Parma, Idaho, through the rest of summer of 1963. And it took him a mere 5 weeks to get into trouble in Idaho. On September 3rd, 1963, Frank was arrested by Caldwell police. He was charged again for forgery after forging a $30 check at a Safeway store in Caldwell. An hour after writing the check, he was arrested and held in jail on a $1,500 bond. He pled guilty on September 13th, and his case was continued to September 27th as the judge awaited an FBI report and a pre-sentence investigation report. Unfortunately, the pre-sentence report wasn't completed by the Idaho Department of Corrections, so he remained in jail in Caldwell until the judge received the report. A brutal stabbing occurred that week at the Idaho State Penitentiary. On September 26, 1963, Earl Bowen murdered fellow prisoner Ernesto Blanco while they waited near the steps between 2 and 3 House near the basketball court to enter the dining hall. Needless to say, the Idaho Department of Corrections was busy. On October 8, 1963, after finally receiving this pre-sentence investigation, the judge sentenced Frank Grooms to the Idaho State Penitentiary for an indeterminate sentence not to exceed 14 years. Frank entered the prison that day. So, his intake: Frank William Grooms, number 11401, crime, forgery, sentence 14 years, plea, guilty, received October 8th, 1963 from Canyon County, race, white, and there's a little note that says small percentage of Cherokee Indian blood, age 22, height 69 inches or 5 feet 9 inches tall, 131 pounds. He had blue eyes, blonde hair, a medium complexion, no deformities, 3 tattoos. He drank and smoked but did not gamble or do drugs. He listed his religion as Catholic. He had no military background. Occupation was a ranch laborer, and he listed himself as divorced, but I couldn't find any documentation to show when that happened. His Bertillon or Bertillon notes that his nickname was Tony, spelled sometimes with a Y and sometimes with an I at the end. Through most of his time in prison, and according to most oral histories, everyone called him Tony. He had a scar above his right eyebrow. His teeth were in fair condition, but he was missing 3. He had a tattooed heart and a cross with T-O-N-I written on a ribbon in the middle of his chest, a vaccination scar on his left shoulder, a scar on his right wrist, a scar below his right kneecap, a heart pierced by an arrow on the back of his right bicep, and a ribbon tattoo on his left bicep that said Frank. So I thought he's got Frank and Tony, both in hearts, tattooed on his body. So.
It's who he loves the most.
Honestly,
I respect the game.
That's it right there. Respect the game, yeah. So, like, looking at his mugshot, he kind of has this classic 1950s bad boy with a baby face kind of look.
Yeah, he's so young.
Yeah. So,
How old is he?
22, yeah.
Yeah, he's young. To have already been arrested 3 times,
Yeah.
right? At
Yeah.
least.
At least, yeah. So it's just wild. That's about
Yeah.
5 years that he's just in and out of institutions. So obviously his file is pretty thick, and his Idaho prison file is mostly actually filled with mail request forms. He was constantly trying to send and receive letters to different people, and then like, hey, I don't want to receive letters from this person anymore. I want to receive them from this person. So he was a pretty prolific letter writer here. His file also contains a list of his cell house movements, and he spent most of his time in Forehouse, moving between the first 3 floors during the years he served for Forgery. He spent his first night in Forehouse, cell 1C, on the 2nd floor of the building. The next day, he was sent to Fish Row, which at that time was in the 1890s or new cell house, and he remained there for processing throughout October and then returned to Forehouse in November. He had several jobs while in prison, including working in the prison tailor shop, which is kind of where Sam and I are recording this in the back of the J. Curtis Earl Weapons Museum. He was going to school for a short time, and he also worked in the prison chapel. But in all of these job assignments, he's only spent a few months at each one. He just didn't seem to want to stay pinned down doing anything, which I think kind of goes with his childhood and the previous decade of his life.
Yeah.
He's always on the move. But with a good record of conduct, Frank actually applied to go before the Spring Parole Board a year and a half into his sentence. On March 25th, 1965, Frank's parole was approved about 2 weeks earlier than his set April 8th date because he had a job secured outside the prison. He was actually planning to return to Parma and work on a ranch because it's spring. They're going to be busy with calves and just all of the chores that go along with spring on a ranch. So it seemed like he was actually behaving himself with his new life back in Parma, and he had no trouble until there was a bit of a rough patch a few days before Christmas on December 22nd, when he was involved in a 3-vehicle collision near the hospital in Nampa. Frank was driving a 1953 unnamed vehicle and said, quote, his motor died just as he approached the 16th Avenue stop sign, headed west on 8th Street. With power lacking for the power brakes, his car rolled into the intersection and was struck from both sides almost simultaneously by 2 other cars meeting there, end quote.
Scary.
Yeah, so scary. That is like one of my biggest fears. Frank was barely scratched, and we will see this happen again later in his life. The other 2 drivers were actually rushed to the hospital, and luckily they both survived. His car was definitely totaled, and another car was totaled. The 3rd car was actually fine. Frank was cited for driving with defective equipment.
Oof.
The following month, on January 28th, 1966, Frank was declared a parole violator. So he gets into trouble, and this time he broke the rule of, quote, associating with known ex-convicts, end quote. So,
Can't do that.
Yeah, you gotta stay away. You gotta keep yourself clean. And he remained in the Canyon County Jail awaiting prison authorities. And in his file, this is like one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. On January 31st, 1966, while Frank was in the Canyon County Jail, he detailed some interesting experiences. He told authorities that while housed with a young man named George Hammond, the 2 had a steady diet of glass.
What?
Yeah. So this is his write-up. Quote, On Friday, January 28th, 1966, at about 3 p.m., he and I both ate a small amount of ground glass. We obtained this glass from a glass bottle. This bottle contained a solution that was given to us to control body lice. When Sheriff Hale found out about this glass eating, he came to the jail about midnight and removed all the glass bottles, razor blades, etc., that he could find in the cell and had us eat some bread that was brought up from the kitchen in his presence. He then instructed a deputy sheriff that if anything unusual came to his attention, to call him at once. Mr. Hammond continued to eat glass after this incident. He obtained the glass by breaking a mirror and grinding it up into small slivers, some of which he ate by merely putting it in his mouth and drinking water with it. He gave us his reason for doing this, that he would rather be dead than go back to the penitentiary. He also mentioned going to the hospital and obtaining a lawyer, and felt as though he could get more legal advice in this way than here in the jail. He suggested we break a mop handle and that I club him behind the ear and knock him out, then punch his eyes out. After I refused to do this, he just kept eating glass and drinking water. He said he had become addicted to it, and it was a habit. Although at the time that I ate the glass, I was very depressed. I became remorseful, and since that time have gotten hold of myself and promised the sheriff not to conduct myself in such a manner again." End quote.
What?
Wow. Yeah.
I saw this and I was like, I have to read this whole document. This is just crazy.
Yeah.
So George was a juvenile delinquent, likely on parole, who got busted stealing mail a few months earlier when he was 17. And around 18 years old, he was no longer a juvenile and knew that penitentiary was likely where he was heading. Frank was 24 at the time and probably recognized the same feelings that his young friend was having. And on February 1st, 1966, Frank was returned to the Idaho State Penitentiary to resume his sentence. Despite his fears, George Hammond was not sentenced to the Idaho State Penitentiary. That is, until he was caught stealing a car from a dealership in Nampa on New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1968.
So the glass did not hurt him.
Glass didn't, but...
That's nuts.
As far as I know, I didn't see any other reports or anything.
That is seriously crazy.
Right? George Hammond arrived in the prison October 1969 as number 12,695. And I'm not sure if George and Frank ever crossed paths. Well, they probably did. And I'm curious what their conversation was.
Hey, you're the glass
How
guy,
was it
right?
coming out is my question. I would add, but...
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
It's very
Wow.
sad.
Yeah.
Very hard to comprehend.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Margaret Hardy,
Right.
we had a female resident who ate some glass.
Yeah.
There's definitely whether it is purely a mental breakdown or it is a plea for attention, there's definitely some mental illness involved either way.
Absolutely, yeah. Frank returns February 1st, 1966. And 20 days later, on February 21st, 3 weeks into his return, the prisoners refused to return to work. So this is the 1966 sit-in strike. And it was this week-long peaceful protest in response to authorities shutting down the prison commissary after counterfeit prison currency was found in the prison yard. There are other factors, civil rights issues and other things that are going on simultaneously. And you can hear all about this in episode 36 of the podcast. So, right off the bat, he's involved in this giant major sit-in strike in his return back to the prison. And then a month after that, on March 24th, 1966, he actually gets into a bit of trouble. And he's sent to Five House to maximum security for violation of Rules 1 and 27-L. So while he was passing through the prison hospital, which stood at that time near Siberia in the cooler in the southeast corner of the prison yard, Frank handed another prisoner his lighter. Having another prisoner's property was and still is a major infraction in prison today. Just for handing his personal lighter that he checked out with the Idaho Department of Corrections to another prisoner, he gets 2 weeks in Five House at maximum security. It didn't mention who he passed the lighter to in the infraction report, so it may have been good reason. Maybe that guy was, trying to commit arson or trying to hurt himself or we're not supposed to smoke or whatever it might have been. But Yeah, he gets into a lot of trouble just for that little thing. And I was like, wow.
Can you imagine if he was like, hey, could you just hold this? I need to tie my shoe.
Yeah. Right.
I for his sake, I hope it was like for a reason and not like, oh no.
Yeah.
I just needed to tie my shoe.
So he actually applies for parole in August 1966, but the parole passes him up. They pass him to apply the following June in 1967. Linda files for divorce against him, noting on the certificate of divorce that she suffered extreme cruelty and noted their separation on February 2nd, 1965, which is when he returned to the prison. Linda requested $35 a month for child support, and the divorce was granted. One document noted that he received a green pair of go-go boots that June. And
Shut up.
No, I was like, am I reading this right? Yeah.
It is almost the 70s, baby.
Uh-huh. Totally. And I looked up advertisements in the newspaper, and yeah, sure enough, go-go boots were a thing. They were going out.
Incredible.
Yeah. And when the board met in October 1967, they decided to grant Frank a final release on November 1st if he maintained a good conduct.
And his go-go boots.
Yes, he's discharged.
And he wore them to...
He's discharged on November 1st, 1967, and he left the prison with 3 wallets, a clutch purse, a boat, 2 belts, 3 buckles, 5 paintings, and 1 leather purse. These were all the remaining hobby shop items that he had built up and created in his collection. And I imagine he walked out the door wearing these green go-go boots, hopefully.
I hope so. They were like, man, those go-go boots are too good to keep from society. Get out of here.
Yeah. It's not long that he is back on the prowl, and I found a marriage certificate between Frank Grooms and a woman named Juanita Turner, filed on December 11th, 1967. So I believe this is his 3rd marriage. Pretty sure, maybe 4th, but I'm pretty sure this is his 3rd marriage. And he starts 1968 a free man with a new wife and a very long rap sheet. In 1968, Idaho's new and current prison was under construction south of town near Gowan Field. And for anyone who's driven that way, you'll know there is wide open desert and some gravel pits along that route. That is where Frank found himself on May 22nd, 1968, with his friend James Funderburg. James, like Frank, was 28 years old and worked as a welder in Boise at a trailer manufacturing plant south of the Boise airport. He also had a record in the Idaho State Penitentiary in 1964 on a 3-year sentence for issuing a check without funds. So the 2 men met up with another fellow they knew in prison, Theodore Ted Starkey. And I'll definitely cover Ted and all of his escapes and escape attempts in a future episode. The 3 men were seen drinking at a bar on Main Street in downtown Boise, which was likely the Bouquet. Now it is the Avery. You can still visit today. Very fine dining today. The Avery Hotel. They decided to leave the bar and stop at a grocery store to buy 2 more 6-packs of beer. They were hot-rodding their car all around Boise, and if any of you listeners have visited downtown Boise on a Friday or Saturday night, you've likely seen or maybe been a member of, maybe unwillingly, the cruise. Have you ever been on the cruise, Sam?
I've never been on the cruise, but I was introduced to it when I first moved to Boise. Someone told me about it, and I've seen it for years since. Yeah. Especially when you're have outside dining.
Yeah. Have you ever been part of the cruise or anything, Skye?
Honestly, this is really terrible for me to admit, but I think it's because I've lived in Meridian and I don't have friends, so I was never out in downtown Boise at night. Tell me what this is.
It's loud.
So basically...
It sounds loud.
You just get your souped up cars.
Your
and
hot rods.
Sometimes it's just like a Nissan Altima, and you just... You just ride around the loop between Maine and Idaho, and there's 2 one-way streets. You just kind of race from one red light to the next.
And you rev.
And you yell at people walking by, and people walking by yell at you, and it's fun. And
have you participated?
Just jokingly, yeah. You have to I've got a little Nissan Altima. I like to rev my engine.
I didn't realize this was a story about you.
So, Frank and Ted and James Funderburg, they're kind of doing this. They're part of this little cultural scene in the 60s. They're just showing off this hot rod car. Frank and James actually decide to take the car out to a drag racing strip on Gowan Field to see how fast this car could go. And according to most accounts, Ted actually stayed downtown while the two headed out to the desert. On their way out, with a couple of six-packs in hand, Frank and James stopped at a gravel pit south of town where they continued to drink and chat and check out this car. James made a derogatory remark about Frank's wife, and Frank snaps. This is what happened next, as written by Frank in his prison file. Quote, "A tire tool was laying on the floorboard on my side of the car, and I picked it up, and I hit Funderburg on the forehead, and then hit him a few more times on the head. I threw him in the trunk of the car, cut his throat with a razor, I picked up Ted Starkey at the Bouquet Bar. Then we drove to Boulder Creek, about 18 miles from Riggins, Idaho. I buried Funderburg about 1.25 miles from the highway. We drove towards Grangeville, Idaho, when we were stopped by the state police. The state police let us go, and we were stopped again in Cottonwood, Idaho. We were returned to Grangeville, Idaho, and held overnight on suspicion of car theft, and then returned to Boise, Idaho, and charged with first-degree murder. The car I was driving belonged to Funderburg." End quote.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. When they're pulled over, the police said that they were acting suspiciously. Frank and Ted Starkey actually sat in jail awaiting their trials. While in jail, Frank was seen as a suspect in the murder of a realtor named Cynthia Reed in Northern California, whose bloodied car was found on May 8th in Redding, California. Authorities noted that she mysteriously disappeared from her house on April 27th, and it was unclear where her body was buried. But it was suspected that her body was along the 150-mile stretch between Redding and Klamath Falls, Oregon. When Frank was interviewed by police, they stated, quote, "He seems to recall killing someone," end quote. Authorities also stated that, quote, "The arrest came after Grooms told a girlfriend that he was involved in a murder but couldn't remember much about it. Investigators are skeptical about Grooms' involvement in Mrs. Reed's possible murder because they believe that he could be trying to establish grounds for a pending insanity plea to avoid prosecution on the Idaho charge," end quote. Her body has never been found, and Frank told investigators that witnesses actually could prove he wasn't in Klamath Falls at the time she vanished. And to this day, her disappearance and suspected murder has never been solved. It's pretty scary.
This is kind of right towards the beginning of, kind of the serial. I don't want to call it the craze, but in the 70s, when especially the West Coast and the Pacific Northwest start to see this huge spike in serial killers. I mean, there were 3 operating in California, or just in the LA area, I think. So it's interesting that they would try to connect him with that. So after he said it the first time, he kind of backed off and said, actually, I didn't have anything to do with that.
Exactly.
Okay.
Well, and I often am pretty skeptical when people claim they don't remember the details of a killing. But if it is true, that's terrifying.
That is so scary.
The idea of being like, oh, I think I killed someone, but I can't really remember. It was a crazy night.
Yeah.
Huh.
Oof. Yeah.
Yikes.
So Frank and Ted actually went before the judge on September 9th, 1968, and pled not guilty. The trial was set for October 21st, 1968. Frank decided to change his plea to guilty, and the judge asked if he was coerced or promised anything to change his plea, and he says no. And during his trial, he documented killing James, but never mentioned Ted Starkey's name at all during this trial before the judge. Boise's pathologist, Dr. Helen Beeman, took the stand and said, quote, "A deep artery-severing throat wound caused Funderburg's death," end quote. She also later noted that there were about 15 marks around his face from blunt force. On October 7th, 1968, Frank was sentenced to life in prison for murder in the first degree by Judge Merlin S. Young. Ted Starkey's trial was postponed to later in the month. On the stand, he admitted to helping Frank dispose of the body, telling the jury that Frank was his, quote, "only friend," end quote. Ted said the death of James Funderburg was a, quote, waste of a very fine boy, end quote. During his trial, it was noted that a bartender saw Ted at the bar and he saw him leave with Frank and James. Later, they stopped in New Meadows after the murder and stopped at a home, and using a wristwatch as a barter piece were loaned $5 by a gentleman who noted that they were both blood-stained. Their clothing was just covered in blood. Frank told the man that the two had been butchering hogs that day. After hours of deliberation, Ted Starkey was charged with manslaughter for his involvement in burying James Funderburg. Judge Merlin Young even stated, quote, "It was a very difficult case to decide," end quote. Ted Starkey was handed a 10-year sentence in the Idaho State Penitentiary. So back to Frank, his intake. Frank Grooms, number 12493, sentence, the remainder of his natural life. Received from Ada County on October 7, 1968. His build was slender. His nativity was Bakersfield, California. He was born July 21st, 1941. His occupation was a ranch laborer. His eyes were blue. His hair was blonde. Complexion medium. Height 5 feet 9.5 inches tall, so he grew a half inch. Weight 135 pounds, and he was 27 years old. Now, this Bertillon looked much different from his early 1960s form. He had many more scars and tattoos. He had 3 dots tattooed under his right eyelid. You can actually see that in his mugshot. He also had several dots on his chest, and the warden actually just simply wrote, quote, "mini tattoos," end quote, on both of his forearms. He had eyeballs on his left thigh, a chicken foot on his left knee, and eyeballs and a mouth on his right knee, and a panther on the back of his neck. So he looks like you and Sam.
I have less face tattoos so far.
True.
Do you think he got any more of either Tony or Frank? I hope he just put more Tonys and Franks on him.
Yeah. You know, I'll post an image in the Facebook group. You can see a lot of that tattoos on his arms in this photo of one of his arrests. And he's just covered. It's incredible. I colorized it just to look at the distinct and colorization of them, and it's pretty interesting. So I'll post that colorized photo. So he's back at prison looking at life at the Idaho State Penitentiary, and he's back in Forehouse awaiting work and cell assignment. He was actually housed on E tier on the 3rd floor, and on April 30th, 1969, his wife Juanita was granted a divorce from him. So 3rd divorce. His life changed on November 17th, 1968. At 7:25 a.m., Lieutenant Joseph Munch was supervising the dining hall as they prepared breakfast. At 7:40 a.m., he was approached by Frank Grooms and Ted Starkey. Quote, "I went outside of the mess hall, and there was inmate number 12493, Tony Grooms, in a wheelchair, holding his eyes closed with both hands. Pushing the wheelchair was inmate 12502, Ted Starkey. Due to the fact that Starkey and Grooms were involved in the same crime, I suspected an escape attempt. But, nevertheless, I took them to the front gate where I informed Lieutenant Keaton, who was that date on duty as acting deputy warden," end quote. Lieutenant Keaton told Munch to take Frank back to the prison hospital to have his eyes washed out with water. Lieutenant Munch asked what happened, and Frank said, quote, "I was attacked by 3 other inmates in number 4 cell house on E tier between number 6 and number 3 cells. 2 of them were holding me to the ground, and one put something in my eyes. I cannot tell you who it was. I am not a snitch," end quote. Lieutenant Munch immediately began investigating, and the guard on duty in Forehouse said there wasn't any disturbance he was aware of while he was on duty. They called for Forehouse to be sealed off as officers arrived to hold an investigation, but by the time Munch and the deputy sheriff arrived, the place was spotless. There was no sign of Frank's attack. Soon after his attack, Warden Stiles, the man who had been the prison chaplain a decade earlier, who served as Raymond Snowden's friend and spiritual guide, was asked to resign his post. During his year as warden, there were 25 escapes, and now a prisoner was being blinded in the prison with chemicals being dumped into his eyes. In his prison file, another fascinating letter arrives from Mrs. Frank Grooms, and so his wife, ex-wife at this point. And she says on August 27th, 1969, "Dear Sir, I understand that Frank Grooms is now medically blind, There are two versions, which I've heard, as to the cause of his blindness. I certainly am in no position to say his blindness was self-inflicted. Nevertheless, I would like to state that Frank told me of an attempt in the past to blind himself. He had a peculiar way of rolling his eyes and blinking as if to clear his vision. I questioned him if his eyes bothered him. He stated that while in prison on a previous charge, he had attempted to blind himself with cigarettes. I asked him why, and he replied that he wanted to shut out all of the ugliness.
Oy.
Frank Grooms is able to see. Perhaps he was held down and acid was poured in his eyes by prison inmates. In my opinion, that is quite possible also. Believe me, it is terribly hard to have someone close to you who you know is so mixed up and tormented inside, sent to prison. In Frank Grooms' case, he's been repeatedly sentenced and confined, but it hasn't been the answer. I know the cold, brutal side of Frank, and I know the insecure, lonely, and gentle side of him. He was the most hurt person I've ever met, yet I didn't really know him at all. You needn't hear more, I'm sure. You probably cope with your job as best you can. I just wanted to express an opinion. We have a long, long way to go. Mrs. Frank Grooms. End quote. I was like,
Wow.
That's quite the letter.
That's so revealing.
It is, yeah. This idea of burning up your eyes with cigarettes to, block out the ugliness was like, oh, wow.
And I thought it was really going to be kind of one of those like don't believe him letters, but it really ends more sympathetically than I think I expected, where she said, we have a long way to go, but like I'll be here to help. Like that was a great letter.
Yeah.
She still has a lot of love for him, but there is kind of this suspicion that it is self-inflicted.
Yeah,
I never
but
really knew him.
Right.
Yeah. So interesting. So
wild.
interesting.
Yeah. Now, pair this with this oral history taken with former prisoner Melvin Aldous on August 28, 1985. He says Frank also wasn't blind at all.
Just as I become trustee, we had a fellow who had some acid spilt in his eyes. And so he used this and pretended to be blind. And he went around with the cane, and one day I was sitting in the back bench at the theater, and he just come to the theater to be with his friends, so everybody thought, because he didn't really pay any attention to the film, but I noticed he come running in there and didn't use his cane and sat down. Didn't look around for the bench or nothing, he just knew it was there and sat down on it. And I thought, that guy's no more blind than nothing. And sure enough, even after I was released and paroled, I read in the paper where this fellow was caught staring at the nurses and sent back to the penitentiary, having perfect 20/20 vision when beautiful legs walked by and got caught at it. So he picked him out for about 8 months of being blind, and he was not blind. He could see very well.
That's one of my favorite oral history quotes, and I remember hearing it for the first time and being like, who are they talking about? So besides this, we work with a janitorial company to maintain the site, and after months of working with the new staff on their team, I asked that they sweep out the entryway of the cell houses, and this is when I had to tell this story. So Debbie, our janitorial staff member, went into 3 House and was cleaning up when she started looking at the mugshots on the cells. And she saw Frank Tony Grooms on the first floor, and he immediately ran up to the front to tell Samuel and other staff at the site that this was her stepfather. So while Frank was being treated for blindness, Debbie's grandmother was taken by this smooth-talking young Frank Grooms, so much so that she actually introduced her daughter, Lena Meyer, who went by Scotty, to Frank Grooms, and they would later get married. So let's take a moment to listen to Debbie and talk about old Silver-Tongue Grooms here. Debbie, what is your last name?
Dannenhauer.
Dannenhauer. Debbie Dannenhauer. Can you step back and tell us, how did you end up crossing paths with Frank?
Okay, back then known as Tony Grooms, when he blinded himself, supposedly, he was in the hospital. My grandmother was a nurse at the hospital and took care of him every day.
Yeah.
He, as I said, Silver Tongue, got her to fall in love with him. He used her. She bought him TVs, all kinds of stuff while he was in prison, and she couldn't afford to put food on the table. I visited 2 different people out here. One time, the visiting room had the barrier. We had to talk on the phone, and another time we sat at tables. But yes, I visited Tony out here with my grandmother.
Yeah.
Yeah, she finally thought she had to tell me about it because I lived with her, and that she could tell that I was going to see something was going on. So she finally told me about him.
Wow.
I want you to meet this wonderful man. Yeah.
Well, what was your first impression when you were in that visit?
Oh, yeah, that he was a sweetheart. I mean, oh, gosh, he's nice. Oh, what? I mean, till I got to know him.
Yeah.
Was he a handsome guy?
Very.
Okay.
Very.
He's very
Very handsome.
Okay. Yeah, just silver tongue. He just
Oh,
said
yeah.
all the right things.
He knew what to say.
Yeah.
Like I said, he had my grandmother buying him TVs, radios. I mean, she couldn't hardly put. I mean, she got during that time, she got arrested for shoplifting a pound of hamburger.
Wow.
Jeez.
Because she was spending all her money on him.
Wow.
When I found out what was going on and seeing what she was doing, I told my mom, which in turn my grandmother had 8 kids, and it got the family involved. My mother then went out to the prison to visit Mr. Tony Grooms to tell him, leave my mother alone. Needless to say, my mother married the man.
Wow. And while he was in prison?
While he was in prison.
Was there any sort of ceremony? Was anybody involved, or was it just like a civil?
Nope.
Okay. Wow.
Nope. And I mean, that's why I call him Silver Tongue.
Yeah.
And the man can talk.
Yeah. Can you kind of describe that? Like, was he super charming? What was it about him?
He was the sweetest man in the world. When he wanted to be, when he wanted something.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, he's a disgrace to the human society. When they got married while he was in prison, and I don't remember the exact year, but I know it was between 71 and he got out in 76. Mm-hmm. So I know that my mother got married again December 30th, 76. So shortly after he got out of prison, they were no longer a thing.
Okay.
As soon as she seen the real him.
Yeah.
The man could see. Trust me, I seen him drive a car. You can't tell me he couldn't see. I seen him drive a car.
Pretty hard to drive a car if you're blind.
Amen. He could see. I mean, I watched him. Well, he told me he could see. He was honest with me.
Yeah.
I don't know how I won his charm, but he told me he could see. He done that to try and get out of prison for sympathy.
Man.
You'd have to be so charming.
He was. I mean, like I said, it's too bad he wasn't that person all the time.
Yeah.
But yeah, he knew how to turn on the charm. But it turned off just like that too. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I seen him go from sweetheart to and it's like.
Yeah.
My cousin and I, when we first met him, when Mom first brought him home, we were over at the house, over at their apartment. And it's when before he had told me he could see. Mm-hmm. He's still claiming to be blind, and we're watching him, and we could tell that he was watching us move around the house. So we're sitting across the room, flipping him the bird to see if he would react to it.
Was he just keeping it cool?
He kept a pretty good straight face, but you could tell he was watching us. I mean, you could see his head move. He trying not to, but when you've got 2 little girls going, trying to.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
A year after he was blinded, he was sent to the new prison site working as a janitor at the prison while it was under construction. The cell doors were solid and mostly escape-proof, but the windows were only covered with a thin mesh screen. This lapse in security meant that on August 21st, 1969, Frank and 2 other men named Truman Watson and Leonard Ortega knocked out the screens, clipped the fencing and barbed wire, and escaped from the prison when the single guard on duty left the control center. Once out of their cells, the trio stole a truck and rode into Boise, where they each took a different vehicle and headed separate ways. Frank headed north in his stolen vehicle with a gun. He stopped at a bar near Orofino, so he made it all the way up to northern Idaho in Orofino. He took a man named William Jensen hostage, and with a gun to the man's neck, the two headed west towards Washington. Police spotted Grooms in the car west of Peck on U.S. Highway 12 soon after, and a high-speed chase ensued, reaching speeds of 100 miles per hour. The pursuit ended when a state police officer shot the tires out of the car. The car skidded out of control and rolled several times. Pinning the hostage driver inside the vehicle. Grooms was ejected and spotted in some weeds nearby. He was miraculously alive and only sustained an ankle injury and bruising.
Listen, ankle injuries are no joke.
But not an ankle injury as bad as yours.
Not a broken ankle, yeah, like a sprained ankle. Like
All
what?
he gets, that's crazy.
It's like his Christmas car crash. How did he not die? How was he totally fine? It's just wild. The police handcuff him and pull the driver from the vehicle, pull him to safety, and Frank is returned to the prison to resume his sentence. The other two escapees were captured shortly after, and Frank's photo hit the Idaho Statesman with a caption, quote, "Recapture arouses grin. Frank W. Grooms, 28, one of three who escaped last week from the Idaho State Penitentiary, was all smiles after his capture in northern Idaho," end quote. I'll post this photo on our Facebook page. In all the articles, it notes that he was medically blind and was taking classes to learn Braille, and a nurse was interviewed, and she stated, quote, "He certainly is not blind. He has a cataract, a white scar on his right eye, that really jumps out at you, but he follows everything around him. He sees everything," end quote. So here's his grin.
Driving a high-speed chase and being blind, that I'm a little skeptical of.
Yeah. And I'll post his mugshot as well, post-blinding here. We'll talk about that in just a moment.
He still looks like a kid. He has a very
Right.
boyish look.
A real babyface Nelson kind of look.
Absolutely. So he's arraigned on September 11th, 1969, and later that month, while in the Ada County Jail awaiting trial, Frank, quote, "and 3 other inmates of the jail turned on water faucets and flooded their cell. They refused to leave the cell," officers said, until tear gas was used to force them out. 2 windows were broken, but there was only slight damage from the water, end quote. He was attempting to escape a second time, and this time it's thwarted. So he actually pleads on October 9th, 1969. On December 3rd, 1969, he is handed a sentence, quote, "not to exceed 3 years, with said sentence to commence at the termination of present sentence being served by the defendant," end quote. So basically, he's giving 3 years for escape. So he is actually given a new number. This is his second intake now, a year after arriving for life for murder in the first degree. So he's received October 7th, 1968 from Ada County for the crime of escape. He's Caucasian, he's 5 feet 9.5 inches tall, 135 pounds, blue eyes, blonde hair, medium complexion, occupation laborer, no military service. He has 2 children, and he has a 10th grade education, he lists. In January 1970, Frank was flown to Springfield, Missouri, to the medical center for federal prisoners. This was likely to analyze and treat his eye. This is documented in the newspaper. In early 1971, Frank was assigned to the school and worked with staff at the clock. This doesn't last long, though, as he, quote, "failed to show up for work," end quote. A report noted his time in the clock didn't work out, mostly because the print show was in the same building as the school in 2 Yard. And, quote, "Grooms likes to converse with his fellow inmates and does so at the top of his voice. I don't hold this to be his fault, but merely typical of the actions of a blind man. However, the resulting disruption to the classes was intolerable, and by mutual agreement, Grooms has stayed in his cell ever since," end quote. So he's just too loud and obnoxious to work in the clock. That same year, Frank participated in the August 1971 prison riot that resulted in the death of Bill Butler, the stabbing of 2 other prisoners, and the destruction of the old prison hospital. According to accounts, quote, Frank Grooms was removed after his recent corneal transplant was injured in the melee, end quote. So likely,
no.
Yeah. So he's sent to that federal camp to have his eyes treated, but likely the riot gas was probably affected his eye treatment. Yeah, and, maybe he was involved in other fights that weren't documented in there. On November 14th, 1972, Frank's life sentence was actually commuted to 30 years in prison. A November 1973 document noted that due to Frank's lack of eyesight, he didn't participate in recreation programs, but he did make art on his own. A neat quote stated, quote, subject receives talking books from the state library and frequently uses this service, end quote. So I was kind of impressed that they were allowing audiobooks at the old Idaho Penitentiary in the early 70s. He was assigned to work in the chapel with Chaplain Chrisman and served as the clerk there. And the chaplain noted, quote, Grooms has made a real effort to exercise more self-control, to maintain a more consistent, positive attitude. He has struggled with some personal problems and has been able to cope with them in a more stable way. He is participating in my couples group, a therapy group, and is receiving therapy from Dr. Sanford. He is demonstrating a more serious effort in making personal changes than I have observed in the 3 years I have known him. He still has a long way to go, but he has made a significant beginning, end quote. He's starting to adapt and make some improvements. Mm-hmm. In that same report, it notes that his girlfriend, Scotty Myers, who is Debbie's mother, had recently terminated visitation with him and correspondence with him. Regardless, Silver-Tongue Grooms always seemed to be able to talk people into helping him with things. So Officers Peterson and Burley, these are Old Penn correctional officers here, reported that Frank was doing well and maintained high standards of cleanliness in his cell and seemed to be getting along with other prisoners with a good attitude. Burley also wrote, quote, right now he's putting in many hours in trying to organize a rodeo club for the new site, end quote. So it might sound interesting, but blind Frank Grooms led the effort to start a rodeo at the prison. The Idaho Statesman ironically titled a piece, Prison Rodeo Eyed, noting that it was hosting a second annual prison roundup and barbecue in August 1973. Quote, there will be 10 field events, a competition for riding clubs, and a complete outdoor barbecue, end quote. Families were invited to visit, and as I mentioned at the beginning of this story, he had an affinity for working with animals. He spent a lot of time on ranches and farms working with horses, cattle, pigs, and others. In September 1973, Frank wrote an article introducing the rodeo to the rest of the prison population, and he noted that their goal was to hit the ground running at the new prison with a rodeo built into the site and the future aspirations of being professionalized. Of course, he needed members. Quote, it must be stated at this time that due to insurance regulations and amateur rodeo rules, only members belonging to the rodeo club will be allowed to ride. All riders will be competing for cash prizes. This is a good chance for some men to learn a profession. Also, it is a way to pick up some extra money after release, end quote. The next month, in the August edition of The Clock, Frank wrote an article titled Rodeo News. For those interested, here is some information concerning the now forming rodeo club. And Frank described the idea came to him when he received material from the Mississippi State Penitentiary about how prisoners were starting a club. Frank got to work creating the prison club and elected officers. He pleaded for prisoners to, quote, quit waiting. We have the backing for the people who count, but we need more members to make this the best club here. We can sit on our duffs until we get out of the site, for once we get out there, it will work. Remember all, that will give you the opportunity to win money, end quote. He needed around 100 members. A write-up by a prisoner named Chesterfield Conklin in The Clock documented the second annual rodeo with an interesting fact that I couldn't corroborate. Quote, the Idaho State Penitentiary is the first prison in the history of the United States to ever hold a rodeo where the inmate and the outside guests are allowed to intermingle, end quote. And the article noted that about 300 guests attended the rodeo. Children came from the horse clubs and surrounding areas. showed their horses and were, quote, talking, laughing, and joking with the inmates. The kids showed no fear of the inmates. They talked to me as if I was the common man on the street, and when I told them I was an inmate, it didn't make any difference to them at all. It sure made me feel good. I couldn't help thinking that it would be a hell of a wonderful world if everyone could be as friendly and understanding as the kids there, end quote.
I attended a rodeo out here in 1969, I believe.
Yeah.
That he was in. At that time, his intentions were to escape during that rodeo.
What was the rodeo like? Where was it at?
Right out here in where the Rose Garden is now.
Oh, like where the botanical garden?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, it was right out there. Just
that's amazing.
It was crazy.
How big was it?
Yeah, that was a good size arena. I mean, it, all fenced in. But I say all fenced in. I mean, those inmates were fairly free out there. I mean,
yeah,
they weren't chained or nothing. But yeah, it was. I mean, it was fun. It was cool. But
what kind of things were they doing at the rodeo? Was it
they were doing broncos, no bulls.
Oh, okay.
But broncos, barrel racing, just horse stuff.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And was it just the prisoners that were doing it, or okay?
Yeah, just the inmates.
Wow.
Yeah, he participated in that.
Okay, while he's blind.
Yeah. You tell me.
What event did he do?
I don't remember.
And do you remember calf tying as well?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Did guards ever participate?
I don't know. I mean, there was plenty around.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
Yeah.
I was only 10.
Okay. Yeah. I know there's a mention in the prison newspaper, The Clock, that there were 300 people there in attendance during one of these rodeos, and it's like the prison population here mixed in with visitors just watching the show.
Yep.
Yeah, was that?
Yep.
Wow. Could you tell were they wearing?
Oh yeah, they were wearing black and white stripes.
They were wearing stripes.
Black and white stripes.
Huh.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Distinguishing.
Oh yeah. I mean, very.
You could tell. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Wow.
Did your entire family go?
Nope, just me and my mom.
And then this was at a point where your mom was married to him?
Just seeing him.
Yeah.
I mean, like I said, and it wasn't long after he got out that she booted him right on down the road.
Yeah.
Overall, it seemed the rodeo club and the interaction with the community was a very positive and pro-social program, and it makes sense that Warden Raymond May would approve a club like this. After the transfer to the new prison, Frank started the GMRA, the Grooms Martin Rodeo Association. 33 men quickly signed up to join the club, many of whom, quote, hadn't even ridden a horse, end quote. Frank and the GMRA were serious about starting the rodeo at the new site and utilized it as a space to sell prison hobby crafts like leather work, which makes sense because we have so many bridles and whips and other things involved in riding horses in our hobby craft collection here. According to Debbie, she thought Frank just wanted to start this club to give him an opportunity to escape. But he didn't. It seemed that starting this club actually helped his case. On October 16th, 1974, Frank's 30-year sentence was commuted to 18 years served consecutively with his escape charge.
And what did he say? Get off our duffs?
Yeah, get off our duffs. Yeah.
That's a good one.
Yeah, I love that.
That is an old 60s phrase if I've ever heard it.
Right. It's great. In February 1975, the Idaho Statesman, this journalist named Ed Muller, actually interviews Frank, who said, quote, "Freedom scares me. The thought of just waking up some morning to be a civilian again. There are things I want to do outside, but I don't know if I could handle it," end quote. Ed interviewed several men in the site who were serving long sentences and had a long history of incarceration. Frank added, quote, "No child is born a criminal, a car thief, or a murderer. But until you find out what went wrong with him, you're not going to stop him from breaking the law again. I would give the short-termers the dirtiest jobs, the roughest treatment, until I knew that I would never see them back again. As it is now, they are coddled. It is the long-termers who end up being ignored," end quote. The other men interviewed seemed to get the same root of this problem with poor childhoods, lack of socialization with the outside, and the mark of being a convicted felon that kind of follows you around when you are paroled. Then, on August 28th, 1975, Frank was discharged from the prison on parole.
Was she starting, once he got out, did she start to get a sense of who he really was?
Oh, yeah. She started believing all the things we told her that he said. I mean, my cousin and I would tell her, and she's like, oh, you're just saying that. Okay.
What was he saying to you that was different?
Well, telling us about all the things he'd done and about not being blind. And
he's trying to be like a cool stepdad or something?
I guess. I mean...
Was it frustrating that your mom didn't believe you guys?
No. My mom didn't raise me, my grandma did, so I mean, no, it didn't.
Yeah.
I just told her she was stupid. She didn't like that very much, but hey.
Yeah.
When my mom told him to get down the road, he again went back to my grandmother, and he talked her into letting him stay there. But that didn't last long. My uncle came along, found him there, packed Tony's clothes, put him in the car, and took him out of town and told him he didn't ever want to see him around his mom again.
So this is after 75, after
the divorce? Yeah,
went
right after. Yeah.
Okay.
They never got divorced.
Oh.
They didn't. Because he wasn't long, and he was back in prison.
He returned as a parole violator on March 18, 1976. A year later, on February 16, 1977, he was released on final discharge from the Idaho State Penitentiary. Frank told authorities that he had employment at a horse ranch in Liberty, Kentucky, for a woman named Jane Page. He seemed to stay out of trouble for a short time, and then in December 1978, Frank was arrested and held in the Elko County Jail in Elko, Nevada, on charges of burglary and being a habitual criminal. He burglarized a radio from a woman's home. Interestingly, his name is listed as Antonio Francisco Grooms in all the documentation moving forward. And
those are his new tattoos.
Yeah, right? Yeah, he had to change Antonio on his chest there. It's his official listing in the Nevada Department of Corrections records. I was blown away by this. So
yeah, that's interesting.
It threw a whole wrench into everything I knew about him, but according to everything else, he is Frank William Grooms. Despite the name change, his arrest in the Nevada State Journal newspaper documents his time within the prison system from the murder in 1968 to the escape the following year, along with 2 other felony convictions. With his record, the Nevada State prosecutor was in line to request a sentence to the Nevada State prison on a term of between 10 and 20 years. However, extradition papers arrived requesting his transfer to Utah because he was suspected of another murder.
Oh, no.
Yeah, this time of a man named Donald Harvey Griggs, whose body was discovered by rabbit hunters about 10 miles northwest of Grantsville, Utah. Donald Griggs was riding around with a man named Robert Morton for about 3 days in Utah drinking. They picked up a third man, who Morton could not remember his name, and the trio rode the Utah countryside, continuing their binge. They were driving away from Salt Lake City when they got into a fight. Robert Morton, quote, said he used a broken bottle to slash Griggs' arm. An autopsy showed that the Roosevelt man bled to death. His throat had also been cut. But Morton testified that the next injury occurred when he and Griggs fell on the broken bottle, end quote. So Robert Morton and the unnamed man actually buried Donald Griggs' body and headed to Nevada, where they sold the man's things and split ways. Morton had a guilty conscience and turned himself in to Sacramento, California police several weeks after the murder. Frank wasn't charged further for this crime, despite the authorities suspecting Frank and some implication they couldn't pin it on him. He returned to Nevada to await trial, where he was charged and sentenced to the Nevada State Penitentiary in January 1979 for burglary and being a habitual criminal. In February, Frank actually appealed the conviction. He complained that his constitutional rights were violated when he was brought into the courtroom both handcuffed and without shoes. This is solid grounds for an appeal because the jury saw him this way and it could sway their opinion on him. Ultimately, the Nevada Supreme Court upheld the burglary conviction, but noted that it was a major mistake. Frank, quote, clearly has a right to appear before his jurors clad in the apparel of an innocent man, end quote. It was deemed just simply a harmless mistake. The jurors who saw Frank said his appearance did not sway them to believe he was guilty. I could not find any details about his time in the Nevada State Penitentiary. A divorce was filed by his wife in February 1981, and he was paroled from the Nevada State Penitentiary in 1984, and according to a later newspaper account, arrested the same year for sexual assault and returned to the prison. He completed his sentence in 1988, an early release he acquired through Good Time. The last thing I found about Frank made me question if I should even tell his story. In April 1989, he did the unforgivable. He was convicted of kidnapping and assaulting an 11-year-old girl.
No.
Yeah. The judge sentenced him to life in prison. The prosecutor wrote scathing remarks about Frank in the Reno Gazette-Journal, hoping he would never be released back into society. Quote, "There's nothing you can do with a guy like this except lock him up and hope he doesn't kill while in prison," end quote. Frank remained in the custody of the Nevada Department of Corrections until his death. He died on June 19th, 2005. Did you or your mom, did either of you stay connected to him after he left and went to Nevada?
My mother got back in touch with him. She thought she wanted to see him again, but she got back in touch with him and found out he was in prison in Nevada, dying in prison at the time, and they were going to get him some kind of release for sympathy or whatever. Mm-hmm. But they discovered that because my mother had a stroke, so they discovered that she wasn't capable of taking care of a dying person.
Wow.
So they wouldn't let him out.
So this is in like early 2000s, mm-hmm. And he's suffered from liver failure or something. And
yeah, hepatitis.
Hepatitis.
Yeah,
oh
and when he died, they sent him her ashes.
And what'd you do with those ashes?
I don't know if I should say. Yeah, I'll say. I threw them in the garbage.
Oh my gosh.
Right where he belongs to be.
Wow. Oh my gosh.
The man bragged about committing first-degree murder and only serving 7 years.
And that is the long story of Frank Grooms, born 1941, died 2005, most of his life incarcerated in some sort of institution.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Real bummer end, though. You were right.
Yeah.
Real bummer.
When I originally had this ready to go with you before you broke your ankle, and I didn't know the tail end of his story because the Nevada Department of Corrections website was down and I couldn't access their prison files. And then this last week, it came back up and I found this stuff and it just was like, ugh. People are complicated, and like he was involved in all these studies about young juvenile offenders, and I'm so curious if they ever followed that study, if he was documented later on at all in these studies. I would love to access those. I'm not sure if we have the ability, because he was a juvenile, to look at those, but man, he's one of those people that they probably have as one of the extremes of somebody who is just institutionalized.
And how interesting that he always seemed to advocate for getting juveniles out and teaching them the correct way early, basically so that they didn't end up like him.
Yeah.
Which in itself is commendable, but of course does not take away from what he does before or after. I do find that a very interesting part of his story.
It's one of those stories like you get to see where this person was held. Like when you visit the site, you know exactly where this guy was spending his time in 1973 before this prison closes. And there are not many cases where we have that direct evidence of exactly where this person was, which cell house, just a wild ride. To have Debbie, this person come in and say, "That silver-tongued Grooms, let me tell you about him," and to, unload her time with this person and to see the impact that he had on her life as her stepfather. It was just Wow.
He ruined a lot of lives.
He caused a lot of mayhem. So many victims in his wake.
The hostage, the burglaries, the robberies, the sexual assaults, the murders, however many that might have been.
Yeah.
The families of all of these victims.
And then his own, wives and children, divorces, all of these broken homes and different things that, I really hope, I try to treat this one with respect. It's difficult. And I, hope I didn't offend by telling his story, just trying to place a person in history and a person within these walls.
We appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. You can tell people the truth.
Skye, what do you have for us today?
Yeah, well, it's not quite as sad at the end. It's also not as long. And to be honest, not as much about the inmate as sort of other things. And this will all make sense. So today I am covering number 6857, Woffie or Woffie. We never know how to pronounce it. Woffie. Woffie Bitt. A great name. So, sources for Woffie's story today are her inmate file, of course, from the Idaho State Archives, newspapers.com records, ancestry.com records, the page about the Duck Valley Indian Reservation at the Nevada State Historic Preservation Office, which is shippo.nv.gov, the Shoshone Paiute website at showpaitribes.org, a map of Indian lands of federally recognized tribes of the United States from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is BIA.gov, the Indian Reorganization Act from govinfo.gov, which is like the official U.S. government publication page, which sounds fake, but actually is really interesting. Another resource about the Indian Reorganization Act, which looks like it's from like an online learning course from the College of Indigenous Studies at the University of Alaska at Fairbanks. The Northern Paiute Language Project at paiute.ucsc.edu. The Climate of Idaho from the Western Regional Climate Center from DRI.edu, which is a nonprofit science research institute from Nevada. An article about the Bruneau Dunes State Park from the Idaho Department of Parks and Recreation. The Bonneville Flood from Digital Geology Idaho from Idaho State University website. A description, an explanation of what an alluvial fan is from nationalgeographic.org. An article on the Idaho sand dunes from the December 2007 issue of The Prospector, which was the publication of the Idaho State Historical Society's old junior historian program, which is uploaded to history.idaho.gov. And then, lastly, the Bruneau Sand Dunes fact sheet from idahofriends.org. So, Woffie Bitt was born Aldous Woffie Bitt on August 15th, 1919 on the Duck Valley Indian Reservation in Elko County, Nevada. Her parents, Ed Bitt and Maggie Kelly Bitt, were both members of a band of Western Shoshone, part of the larger Shoshone Paiute tribes. Woffie is the only resident of the women's ward to have hailed from the Duck Valley Reservation, so I think that this deserves a quick rabbit hole.
Yeah.
So, a little bit about both the Duck Valley Reservation and the Shoshone Paiute tribes. So the Shoshone Paiute tribes are the current descendants of the Western Shoshone and the Northern Paiute, whose ancestral lands stretched across an area that now makes up the states of Idaho, Nevada, and Oregon. And various bands of the Shoshone and the Paiute have worked together for pretty much time immemorial, and so the tribes have almost nearly always been closely related. President Rutherford B. Hayes established the Duck Valley Reservation for the Western Shoshone specifically on April 16, 1877, through an executive order which made up roughly 225 square miles of land in Elko County in northern Nevada. Then about 7 years later, in 1884, some politicians tried to move the Western Shoshone off the Duck Valley Reservation onto the Fort Hall Reservation with the Shoshone Bannock tribes to then open up the Duck Valley Reservation lands to non-indigenous settlers, but leaders of the Shoshone Paiute band successfully resisted those efforts. Then, 9 years after the first executive order, on May 4th, 1886, President Grover Cleveland issued another executive order which extended the borders of the reservation another 225 square miles, and then opened the use of the reservation to the Northern Paiute, as well as the Western Shoshone, which had always had that use of the land. Then, 4 years later in 1890, the borders of the state of Idaho solidified, and the Duck Valley Reservation became made up of equal parts of land in the states of Nevada and in Idaho. Then, in 1910, President William Howard Taft issued another executive order for another extension to Duck Valley in order to protect important reservoir sites. So, a fun fact, the Duck Valley Indian Reservation is one of only a handful of federally recognized reservations to cross state borders. The largest and probably most recognizable reservation to cross state borders is the Navajo Nation, which, of course, takes up that sort of four corners area of Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico. But the Duck Valley Reservation is one of only a few to cross state borders, which I thought was interesting. Under the watchful eye of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, members of the Shoshone and Paiute bands farmed and ranched on Duck Valley. Then, in 1934, Congress passed the Indian Reorganization Act, sometimes called the Indian New Deal. But here are a few really important main things that the Indian Reorganization Act accomplished. So first, it prohibited lands to be taken away without tribes' consent and allowed the Secretary of the Interior to take more tribal lands into trust and make new reservations on those lands. It also established a loan program for tribal development and set up tribal business charters, and it established a native preference for hire for jobs in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But most importantly, it recognized tribal governments and promoted tribal self-government by encouraging tribes to adopt constitutions and charters of their own. So, in 1936, the Shoshone and Paiute bands united and formed a tribal government through an adoption of a constitution and bylaws. Then, almost 100 years later, about 80 years later, in 2016, Congress passed the Nevada Native Nations Land Act, which added another 82 acres of forest land to the reservation, and then actually added thousands of acres to other reservations in the state of Nevada as well. So, as it currently exists, the Duck Valley Indian Reservation consists of 289,820 acres. 12,800 of those acres are for an irrigation project, 22,231 acres are wetlands, and 82 acres are forest land. 268,816 acres are for cattle grazing, and then 8,204 acres are for water storage and commercial and residential areas. And farming and ranching remain mainstays from tribal members who live on the reservation. And that's about 1,700 of the 2,000 enrolled members who live on the Duck Valley Reservation there that straddles the borders of both Idaho and Nevada. So, that's our little rabbit hole. So back to Woffie. So Woffie was the youngest of three daughters born to Ed and Maggie. She had two older sisters, Edmona and Ramona. Her father, Ed, was a farmer, and in Nevada, he worked on someone else's farm. The 1920 census states that the family's native language was Paiute, called Numu, but there were boarding schools and day schools in which the Bitt girls learned English as well. Then, by 1930, Ed was able to buy some land on the Idaho side of the reservation, and the family moved to Riddle, Idaho. But of course, because the reservation spans both states, records place Woffie back and forth between Nevada and Idaho throughout the 1930s, and this, of course, is something that we'll see kind of throughout her whole life. So, according to the 1940 census, Woffie lived in Riddle with her oldest sister Edmona, Edmona's two sons, and Woffie's daughter, who had been born in 1938. I don't know who her daughter's father was, and in fact I noticed in all the records I found that the kids of both Edmona and Woffie retained Bitt as their last name. They didn't take whoever their father's last name was. And I could never find if they were married, who their partners were. They were not listed in these censuses. But there is a possibility that the Western Shoshone and or Northern Paiute were matrilineal societies, meaning that social position is passed through mothers instead of through fathers, like we're most familiar with in sort of quote-unquote Western societies. But I couldn't find any sources that confirmed or denied that. And so I can't say that that is for sure. It's just an interesting detail I noticed, and there's just a possibility that they just chose to keep Bitt as the last name, and there's no larger reason for that. It just was something I noticed.
Well, and even if they weren't specifically matrilineal, that doesn't mean that, different groups wouldn't be more open to different ideas than one who's raised in, Western American society.
Yeah, totally. Generally, Woffie just lives a quiet life, and her crime is pretty minor, so much so that it didn't even make the newspapers or garner much attention from the authorities. And it all begins in Bruno, Idaho. So let's talk about Bruno, because we do talk about Bruno on this podcast.
That was a solid joke.
Thank you. So, because we do talk about Bruno, and that is Bruno Sand Dunes on this podcast, here's a little Bruno Sand Dunes rabbit hole. For our listeners new to the state or those located out of state, Idaho, as such a big state, has quite a diverse climate. We have snowy mountain ranges, we have deep canyons, we have high grassland valleys and plains and fertile lowlands. It's really very fun. But uniquely, we have desert sand dunes, basically a much smaller version of what you would find in the Sahara or Arabian deserts. It's in southern Idaho, just about 60 miles of Boise, and they are, of course, called the Bruno Sand Dunes. In fact, the Bruno Sand Dunes is home to the tallest freestanding dune in North America, with its peak at 470 feet above the surrounding desert floor. The Bruno Sand Dunes sometimes is called Idaho's Sahara because the dunes look so much like the sand dunes we think of in a movie like, for example, Dune. The Bruno Sand Dunes was created, scientists think, by the Bonneville Flood roughly 15,000 years ago. And about 1,000 to 1,500 years before the flood, a natural dam had been created in a place called the Red Rock Pass by what's called an alluvial fan from the gravel of two mountain ranges, the Portneuf to the east and the Bannock to the west. And so basically, an alluvial fan is a triangle-shaped deposit of sediment that builds up as flowing water leaves sediment behind. As water, is flowing through this area, there's Bonneville Lake that's very close by, and so these alluvial fans, these triangle-shaped deposits, are actually damming up Bonneville Lake for a while. But soon the water erodes one of the fans at Red Rock Pass, which eventually caused a landslide and a catastrophic flood event that released about 5,000 cubic kilometers of water. It's roughly 1,200 cubic meters, so it's probably a lake roughly 50 miles long by 50 miles wide and 1,500 feet deep. Wow. So it's a huge area of the water that gets released into this area. And so as the floodwater rushed through the cove where the dunes currently are, it swirled around the area like an eddy, which is a circular current that flows opposite of the main river flow, kind of like, when you flush your toilet, or if you, have something with water in it, or like a cup, and you spin it really fast so that you get a little cyclone in it, and then you just stop it, or you turn it the other way. That is kind of what happens. And so then these huge sediment deposits get stuck in this basin, and so that forms higher and higher into these dunes that we know today. And another curious thing about the sand dunes in Idaho is that they mostly stay in one spot. So the Bruno Sand Dunes are made up mainly of two large dunes that cover 600 acres total, one of which, of course, is the big 470-foot tall one. So usually dunes in larger deserts get blown around by the wind, moving in only one direction, and so it causes the dunes to literally move across the landscape. At the Bruno Sand Dunes, however, the wind tends to blow equally in each way. So even if the sand moves in one day, the wind on another day sort of causes the sand to go back to where it was before. So they generally kind of stay in the same place, which is interesting. In 1967, the Bureau of Land Management provided about 4,200 acres for the establishment of the Bruno Sand Dunes as a state park. A year later, another 600 acres was added to the park, and the Bruno Sand Dune State Park opened in 1970. So since 1970, visitors have come to camp, stargaze, hike, horseback ride, and sandboard and sand sled, which is exactly what it sounds like.
So cool. And
in nearby lakes at the foot of the dunes, you can boat and fish. Have you guys been to Bruno Sand Dunes before?
When I was little, but I haven't been as an adult, and it's been we need to go do it, and then we just never make it out there. So that'd be a good time right now, fall.
It really would.
Good time to go.
I'm sure the Brunos get hot during the summer.
Oh, yeah.
In East Idaho, there is a little sand dune above St. Anthony, kind of in between past St. Anthony before Kilgore. And we went up there all the time as kids and play in the sand and roll down the hills. And so perhaps not as the biggest peak in Idaho as far as sand goes, but I'm kind of familiar with those experiences.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah, I've never been. My brothers went because they were always in scouting. and they like stayed the night there and stuff. So I've actually never been. I really want to go. But according to all the sources I read, it's a beautiful spot to see nature, especially in the early morning and late evenings. Common animals include coyotes, badgers, rabbits, lizards, nighthawks, herons, owls, and even lizards, and scorpions.
Yeah.
Ooh, no, thank you. There's a great quote from the Bruno Sandude's page at the Digital Atlas of Idaho from ISU, and it says, quote, "There's no hunting in the park except with cameras and binoculars," end quote. And then an astronomy observatory for the park was completed in 1998, and it is open to the public on Fridays and Saturday nights. They have a whole program. Park rangers are there. You can see it's very clear. And camping season is March through October. And for more information, visit parksandrecreation.idaho.gov.
Last time we were at iDoc, Skye, some of the trustees told us that they got to go out to that observatory and be able to watch the stars, and they described it as just being an incredible experience.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I need to get out there eventually. Now, back to Woffie. So, according to authorities, Woffie stole a blank check from her employer named Delphin Coig. He was a local farmer. And she stole this blank check after she left working for him. And this probably would have been around sometime in August 1945. Couldn't find a definitive date. So, after she steals this check, she goes to Mountain Home, Idaho, with a friend, Frida Marsh. And there, Woffie and Frida visited Gladys Baker's dress shop, and they bought some clothes. Woffie made out the check for the sum of $300 and signed the check with Delphin Coig's name. She used $110 for clothes and the remaining $190 she asked for in cash. It's not totally clear how authorities traced her connection to the check, but if she signed it with her employer's name, it was probably fairly easy to figure out who had done it. The Elmore County prosecuting attorney claimed that Woffie was a habitual criminal and that she'd been arrested for a forgery at least once before. I couldn't find any newspaper evidence or records in her file to confirm that or provide any further details. Frida was held in the Elmore County jail, but I think ultimately was released without being charged, as evidence pointed pretty much to Woffie being the main party involved in the crime. There isn't really even newspaper coverage of her appearance in court or anything, so I think it must have been pretty cut and dry kind of case, especially since she pled guilty. She was sentenced by Judge Charles F. Kolsch to 4 months to 1 year at the Idaho State Penitentiary, and Woffie Bitt entered the Idaho State Penitentiary on September 6, 1945. Just a quick reminder, this is only about 3 weeks after VJ Day, which was signaled the end of World War II, especially for the United States. So there is a possibility that wartime conditions presented circumstances that led Woffie to do what she did. Again, not trying to excuse, just finding a potential explanation. Woffie entered the women's ward at a fairly unusual time. She was just one of 3 women in the women's ward. And she was only one of 3 the entire time that she was there.
Wow. Interesting.
Yeah, so a quick review of the Excel spreadsheet that we have with all the data from the women's ward shows a really, really interesting thing that I never noticed before. During the years in which the U.S. was involved in World War II, which was about 4 years, so, over this 4-year period of time, how many women would you guess spent time in the women's ward?
7.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to guess like 5.
Okay, so you guys actually are like closer than I would. I would have assumed it was more, but between December 8th, 1941, which is the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor and the day that the U.S. declared war on Japan, and August 14th, 1945, which was VJ Day, just 8 women lived in the women's ward at the Idaho State Penitentiary. And again, not just were arrested, were like in the women's ward at all. In other words, only 1 woman was arrested in 1941. The entire year of 1941, just 1 woman sent to the penitentiary. When she entered, there were women serving from arrests in 1937 and 1939, but the only women who spent time at the prison during the war years were arrested during the war years. Only 1 woman who entered the prison during that same time period served longer than a year. And the main reason for that was because she entered in January 1945, and it was only 8 months before the war was over. In the same amount of time, so in the same span of 4 years, both before and after the war, an average of 15 women served time in the women's ward, nearly double the amount who served during wartime. So knowing what I know about women's roles on the home front during World War II, which is more than you would think because I wrote an entire chapter about it, I would almost guarantee that this anomaly is connected to the war in some way. One reason, there's fewer male cops to police what's going on. Another reason is more women are needed in jobs, which obviously kept a lot more women busy and productive. And there's also just a desperate need for the resource of man, or in this case, woman power in every industry. So that's why no one stays longer than a year, because we need people on the home front. Woffie gave me a chance to dig into this, and I've never seen anything like that. I just thought that was so interesting.
That's super fascinating.
Yeah.
Skye, you could speak to this better than I can.
Mm-hmm.
Do you suppose that better economic opportunities during the war also helped prevent women from writing bad checks specifically?
Yeah, for sure. I probably need to look more into what specifically was going on in the Idaho home front. Of course, my research was just generally what's going on. And Idaho is, being it's so rural for most of its history, and arguably still is significantly more rural than urban, I would be interested to know. But, if you think about it, these women are having to run the farms that their husbands and sons are leaving. And so certainly there are better economic opportunities, but an Indigenous person on a reservation, I don't know if those same economic conditions would have existed for someone like Woffie, which may explain why she did it. But I also think that the prison and sort of the Board of Corrections was willing to let people, especially, because again, I didn't look at the men's side of things, so I can't quite speak to it, but I would imagine for women, because so many men are gone on the home front, better economic opportunities, like you're saying, but also they're just busier. They have to. And this is, again, something I talk about in my dissertation. They're not just working in the factories. They're collecting scrap metal. They're collecting rubber. They're saving fat. I was, because I'm a nerd, watching this movie from World War II, and a character buys a tube of lipstick, and her roommates actually are like, how dare you, that's so selfish. So they're just busy trying to live their life as normal as possible with all of these restrictions, and they're collecting things for the good of the men overseas, right? To help their husbands, brothers, cousins, whoever they know is over there. And so I found that really interesting, and just because I thought about it so much in my dissertation, it just was an interesting pattern that she helped me see and explore. And so for that, I am grateful, even if we don't have that much about her in particular. So anyway, that's a nerdy rabbit hole.
That's very, very interesting, Skye. We often talk about how the war affected the men and the incarceration of men both before, during, and after. But we seldom bring up the impact on the women incarcerated here. That's fascinating.
So anyway, Woffie was just one of 3 women when she entered. The population briefly dropped to 2, but within a month they were joined by someone else. So while she was in there, the population was always at 3. And if you were listening very closely earlier, I gave a clue about how long Woffie spent at the Idaho State Penitentiary. It was not long. She doesn't have very many documents in her file, so it's fairly safe to assume that her stay was pretty uneventful. Her pardon, a full pardon signed by Governor Ira H. Masters, was signed on January 10th, 1946. Woffie served 4 months and 9 days of a 4-month to 1-year sentence. According to the newspaper article I found, 11 other inmates were granted full pardons at the time. So again, I'm curious how much the war and the immediate post-war period had something to do with that. Because not all 11 were women. Most of them were men. So it's interesting that they get full pardons, not just being released on parole or given their final releases, full pardons. And so, as we so often see, Woffie went back home and she lived a quiet life for the next 35 years. The 1950 census lists her as living in Riddle, Idaho with her parents, her 2 daughters, and her 2 nephews. At some point around 1950, or maybe just before it, she moved to Hanford in Central California and married a man named Manuel Alvarez. In July 1981, so about 31 years later, again, I kind of lose track of her, which is good news, she moved home to Bruno, and within 6 months, on December 26, 1981, Woffie passed away from natural causes in a hospital in Owyhee, Nevada. She is buried in the Owyhee Old Cemetery, and according to her obituary, she was survived by her husband, daughters, sisters, and 10 grandchildren. And I think the rest of her life and how very quiet it was proof that she was not, as authorities claimed upon her arrest, a habitual criminal. And so that's, again, short, sweet story that I have. And maybe not super sweet, but, again, she does her time, does her number, and goes on and is very productive. She really allowed me to dig into some subjects and look into some facets of the prison that I had never thought of before. And now I want to do a big study about what was going on at the prison during World War II. How were conditions different? Were people treated differently? To me, it seems like the answer is yes. But and then I'm also grateful to be able to dig into the Duck Valley Reservation and the Shoshone Paiute tribes, because more often than not, the majority of reservation business is done in the Nevada side, and so we don't get a lot of inmates from Duck Valley. And so I really was grateful for that opportunity to be able to talk about those indigenous tribes native to the area that we call the state of Idaho, and tell their story a little bit. So
that was great, Skye. I really enjoyed that. Your two stories could not have been more different. For all the times we parallel each other, these ones were yin and yang, exact opposites. We have a woman who commits one crime and never commits another crime again in her entire life and serves a very short sentence.
Yeah, 4 months. It's like a jail sentence.
Yeah.
And then another guy who just can't help himself, that's just constantly in the middle of some drama, takes somebody's life, maybe multiple people.
I'm glad we ended with yours, Skye.
Me too.
Yes. Yeah. I do want to apologize to the audience, but we are going to take a little bit of a break, just a sort of a mid-season break for about a month while I try to get literally back on my feet and, not sleeping the day away so I can have a little bit of time to work on more episodes and as well as sort of give Sam and Anthony the month of October mostly off. We're going to be back, I think, pretty close to towards the end of it, but, allow them the time and space that they need to give you guys an awesome Halloween experience. We will be back. But we wanted to kind of give you this little warning at the end of the episode, mostly for me to say I'm so sorry. This clearly was not in my plan, but just appreciate your patience while I'm on the mend. And but we will be back much sooner than we were during our last season break. But broken ankle.
We've had great reception. We've had great feedback. Thank you, everyone, for your support. Thank you for continuing to listen. We are not leaving for long. We're just stepping out of the room, putting up some Halloween decorations. Come to our events. Come visit us. Come hear us speak. Wish Skye that she's feeling better. Send get well cards. And come November, we're going to be back and better than ever. We got some good stuff coming. The second half of the season is going to be fantastic. We're going to have some interviews with Big River Paranormal. We're going to have interviews with authors, with historical sites, and we have some wild, wild stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. So stay tuned.
That's right.
Thank you, everybody. We love you all. Do your own time.
Do your own number.
Take care.
And get off your duffs.
Get off your duffs, yeah. Come to the old pen.
If you enjoyed Behind Gray Walls, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. Not only do we get to hear your feedback about the show, but it helps others find us as well. If you're interested in finding out more about the podcast and to see mugshots of the inmates featured in today's episode, follow our Facebook group at Behind Gray Walls Podcast. And we have a podcast Instagram as well. You can find us on Instagram at Behind Gray Walls Pod.